His name was Saul of Tarsus, and throughout his entire life he was convinced that he had seen and heard the risen and glorified Jesus. The vision he had had on the road to Damascus became the affirmation that he was an apostle with the same status as the 12. This is the story of his 3 missionary journeys. The Asia that the Bible talks about actually is Asia Minor, or modern-day Turkey. But this is Paul's world, the great Roman Empire and its fabulous cities of the 1st century. We join him now in his city of Tarsus. Tarsus. Situated on the river Cydnus, 12 miles back from the sea, was known for its schools of philosophy and oratory, and great men of learning took their academic education here. It was in this city that Antony chose to meet with Cleopatra in hopes of joining together to form a new empire in the east. Because of this famous meeting, the city gate of Tarsus carries her name, Cleopatra's Gate. She captivated all who could hear the sound of her honeyed voice and could speak without an interpreter to Persians, Syrians, Arabs, Jews, Bedouins, Ethiopians, not to mention Egyptians, Greeks, and Romans. The founding of Tarsus began around 1,000 years before the birth of Jesus. It is because of this cosmopolitan atmosphere Saul would develop his wisdom and rhetoric. Modern-day visitors can still find the remnants of the city of Paul's time. Here, an enormous Roman temple, its marble facing taken away to expose the brick. The Taurus Mountains rise up behind the city to elevations as high as 12,000 feet. Saul of Tarsus knew these mountains well, having passed through them many times as he walked to the great cities of Asia Minor. It is possible that the swampy tropical marshland near his home city of Tarsus gave him malaria, which he refers later as the thorn in the flesh. We can imagine how the youngsters of Tarsus loved the swimming holes along the river Cydnus. From here, Saul traveled to Jerusalem to study under the great Jewish teacher Gamaliel. Saul became a rabbi, astute in the laws of Judaism, and because he was a Pharisee, a sect extremely hostile to Jesus, Saul persecuted the Christian brethren wherever he could find them. By Jewish tradition, Saul learned a trade, tent maker, like his father. This allowed him to earn a living when he finally became an apostle. Goat hair tents automatically shrink and close tight from rain and repel insects as well as heat. Saul made tents not only for Roman legionaries, but for the nomads of Asia Minor, the nomads who are still there today. Saul was traveling to Damascus to find and arrest anyone who belonged to the way, when suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. He fell to the ground and heard a voice. "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? I am Jesus whom you are persecuting. Now get up, go into the city, and you will be told what to do. Saul now changed his name from the Hebrew to the Latin. The world will come to know him as Paul. Antioch in Syria was the third largest city of the Roman Empire, next to Rome and Alexandria, with a population of over 500,000. Barnabas went to Tarsus to look for Paul, and when he found him, he brought him to Antioch. So for a whole year, Barnabas and Paul met with the brethren and taught great numbers of people. Paul soon learned that an apostle's life is little different from a shepherd's, since a shepherd must be able not only to withstand loneliness, but to be far away from any kind of social life of the towns and cities. The shepherds of these lands are mentioned many times in the Bible. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. On the mountain are many tombs, and below these tombs a cave was turned into a church, perhaps the first church of the Christians. In the church at Antioch, there were prophets and teachers. There was Barnabas, and there was Simeon called the Black, Lucius of Cyrene, Manaen, who had been brought up with Herod the governor, and Paul. While they were worshiping the Lord and fasting, the Holy Spirit said, "Set apart for me Barnabas and Paul, for the work to which I have called them." So after they had fasted and prayed, they placed their hands on them and sent them off. They sailed to Cyprus, and then on to the southern coast of Asia Minor. The first city they would have seen from the ship is called Sidde. The Roman theater is the most imposing building in the city, and it can be seen for miles around. The Greek historian Strabo tells us that the Cilician pirates used the harbor of Sidde as a dockyard and auctioned their captives in the city center. These Cilician pirates were from Paul's city of Tarsus. In the year 67 BC, the great military genius of Rome, Pompey the Great, swept the pirates from the sea in just 1 year. The Roman baths are virtually intact and are now used as a museum. It is here that we find the three graces from Greek mythology. They are a common feature of classical literature and represent beauty, charm, and grace. The eagle is the symbol of Rome, and on this Roman sarcophagus, we find two little angels of death, reminding us that angels were around way before Christians. The next city along this coast is called Aspendus, and it possesses the most perfectly preserved theater in the Roman Empire. You can almost see the 20,000 Roman citizens sitting here in the cavea, enjoying the Greek plays of Aeschylus, Euripides, Sophocles, and Aristophanes. The structure we see here is called skene, and from this structure we get the word scene. A huge canvas awning was suspended over the spectators to protect them from the brilliant sun, as plays were attended during the day, usually from morning to dusk. Comedies and tragedies performed by traveling troupes of actors entertained the Greco-Roman cities of Asia Minor for over 700 years. Through the centuries, theaters became more and more beautiful. Just behind the theater is a Roman basilica. The buildings in Athens became a model for the Roman basilica. Around the 4th century, we find the Christians building basilicas for their churches, even using the 3 arches, as we see here in the Roman Basilica of Aspendus. Paul and Barnabas arrived in the port city of Attalia at the base of the Taurus Mountains. Today, this city in southern Turkey is called Antalya and is one of the more beautiful and picturesque settings in all of Asia Minor. They made a journey of 160 miles to Antioch in Pisidia, and Paul arrived exhausted, suffering a severe illness, probably malaria. In the synagogue, almost the whole city gathered to hear the word. When Paul saw the envy and hostility in the crowd, he made the decision to turn to the Gentiles. Great persecution was stirred up against Paul and Barnabas, and they were expelled from the city and the region. So they shook the dust from their feet in protest against them and went to Iconium. And the disciples were filled with joy and with the Holy Spirit. Iconium is today called Konya and is the headquarters for the Mevlana sect of the whirling dervishes who perform their dance only in the month of December. There was a plot afoot among the Gentiles and Jews, together with their leaders, to mistreat them and stone them. But they found out about it and fled to the Lycaonian cities of Lystra and Derbe, where they continued to preach the good news. Here in the Plateau country are many nomads, living today as they did in the time of Paul, pitching their tents, following their flocks, moving from pasture to pasture. We can almost imagine Paul talking to these people. We quote now from Paul's own words in the Bible. "We are bringing you good news, telling you to turn to the living God who made heaven and earth and sea and everything in them. He has shown kindness by giving you rain from heaven and crops in their seasons. He provides you with plenty of food and fills your hearts with joy." Trouble arrived from Antioch and Iconium, zealots who turned the crowd against Paul once again. They stoned Paul and dragged him outside the city, thinking he was dead. But after the disciples had gathered around him, he got up and went back into the city. The next day, he and Barnabas left for Derbe. It is wondrous to see the nomads living the same today as they did in the time of Paul, a strong and independent people, needing none of the empty accoutrements of modern life. They happily ignore the rest of the world and its endless problems. They use the same old wagons of 2,000 years ago. The stitching on the bags of grain is the same as Paul used on the tents. The same old wooden pitchforks where the tines are still shaped by hand. Hollowed out logs still serve as troughs for the animals. As Paul walked across Asia, he probably accepted a ride now and then from nomads. It could have been on a donkey, or it could have been on one of these characters. You can tell she's a woman by her eyes. Well, that's her friend over there, and she's not very friendly. One-hump dromedaries were used by nomads. It gave them more mobility and allowed them to expand to larger tracts of pasture land. Paul and Barnabas enter the city of Perge. On either side were statues of Greek and Roman gods. The main street was colonnaded with a waterway down the center. The marketplace, or agora, is surrounded by shops, and wonderful goods arrive by caravans from all over the Roman Empire. In the center of the courtyard is a Tholos temple dedicated to the god of fortune. The people of Pamphylia were among the first people of Asia to hear the good news. The stadium had a seating capacity of about 12,000. Under the Emperor Trajan, there was one exhibition where more than 10,000 gladiators fought to the death. And there is a story of one gladiator becoming so rich he loaned money to the Roman emperor. The ancient city of Phasaelis was the favorite of Alexander the Great. We can imagine the grain ships lying at anchor as they slowly made their way from Alexandria to Rome. The main street leads us across the isthmus to the military harbor, where we can clearly see the channel for fighting triremes to enter the harbor. We see the foundation stones for the defensive wall that went out to protect the harbor mouth. Just a few miles away is the ancient city of Attalia. These wagon and chariot ruts lead through Hadrian's Gate, the entrance to the ancient city. Hadrian was one of the 5 good emperors of Rome and traveled to all points of the empire, inspecting the cities carefully, making improvements wherever they were needed. This region was settled by the Seljuk Turks, who were enemies of the Ottoman dynasty. This fluted minaret is typical Seljuk style. Paul and Barnabas went aboard a ship in this harbor and sailed back to Antioch in Syria. Their first missionary journey was coming to a close. Upon arriving in Antioch, they gathered the church together and gave them a full report of their progress with the first missionary journey. And Luke tells us that the word Christian was first used in Antioch. Up until that point, the Christians called themselves disciples or brethren. Others called them the people of the way. And now Paul and Barnabas had a sharp disagreement. Barnabas wanted to take John Mark with them back to the cities of Asia. But Paul did not think it wise to take him, because he had deserted them in Pamphylia and had not continued with them in the work. They went their separate ways. Barnabas took John Mark and sailed for Cyprus, but Paul chose Silas and left commended by the brothers to the grace of the Lord. He went through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches. Today, all modern traffic uses the ancient Roman bridge built by the Emperor Hadrian. Roman structures abound all over the Mediterranean world, surviving centuries of wear and tear and earthquakes. The river Cydnus in Paul's hometown of Tarsus. He must have paused here to reflect on his youth and how much he had changed, especially since his vision on the road to Damascus. As a Pharisee, he would not tolerate any new faiths. And ironically, the Pharisees became the catalyst for such concepts as a belief in a Messiah, in angels, in immortality, and even a resurrection. Walking the 30 miles to the mountains would be quite pleasant for Paul. The road is gentle and not at all very steep. The Taurus Range in this locale is a huge barrier, precipitous and impossible to climb for any man. However, there is one location where the mountains provide a small passage that has been used by all the great armies of history, including the Persians, Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, Anthony and Octavian. We follow Paul into the ancient land of Phrygia. It's called the Cilician Gates. Here in Phrygia lived a poor peasant named Gordios. He didn't know it, but an oracle had prophesied that an old wagon would bring them a king, would put an end to all their troubles. And when he rode his wagon up to the temple of Zeus, he at once was made king of the Phrygians. His son was King Midas, who was to ask Dionysus of a favor that all things which he touched should be changed to gold. He received his wish, but now even the food that he touched became gold, and he finally begged the god to take the favor back. Midas lies in his tomb, shaped like a pyramid, next to the ancient city of Gordios. It was here that the young Alexander was offered the key to Asia, if he could just untie the Gordian knot. Alexander solved the problem by cutting the knot with his sword, and since then, cutting the Gordian knot has become proverbial for finding a way out of a difficulty. The tomb for Alexander the Great was prepared by a Greek sculptor in the port city of Sidon. Alexander never used this tomb. He died in Babylon and was buried in Alexandria. But here he is, conquering the Persian king Darius, only to marry his beautiful daughter Barsinoa. Paul moves through the countryside, past the tomb of King Midas and the ancient city of Gordian, and on through the rolling countryside towards Alexandria, Troas. During the night, Paul had a vision of a man of Macedonia begging him, "Come over to Macedonia and help us." Luke goes on to tell us, after Paul had seen the vision, we got ready at once to leave for Macedonia, concluding that God had called us to preach the gospel to them. They embarked from the port of Alexandria, Troas, in the Troad, and sailed out across the northern reaches of the Aegean Sea. They passed by the island of Samothrace and arrived eventually at the port city of Neapolis. The ancient harbor of Neapolis is now called Kavala in northern Greece, and the ancient harbor of Neapolis is virtually intact. Here the fishermen still repair their nets as they did in ancient times. The fishermen work at night, and these bulbous lanterns at the stern end of their fishing dories are used to attract the fish into their nets. A block away from the harbor is St. Paul's Church, and in the courtyard is a stone bollard used by sailors to step off the ships in ancient times. Paul could have used this bollard as a stepping stone. Here in Kavala, they deliver the milk late in the afternoon instead of early morning hours. And occasionally, Greeks will wear the colors of their country. White stands for the froth of the sea, and blue is the sky of Greece. A fear of open spaces, a fear of the marketplace, a fear of going out of doors in the Greek language is agoraphobia. This could be a case of agoraphobia. "6 miles away from Neapolis, in this tobacco field, in the year 42 BC, we would have seen the Battle of Philippi taking place. It was a Roman civil war, Roman against Roman. The two conspirators, Brutus and Cassius, had assassinated Julius Caesar, and now they had led their armies into Asia, where they plundered the cities and were in control of the seas from the harbor of Neapolis. Octavian was the grandnephew and adopted son of Julius Caesar. He detested these men who had murdered Caesar. He was harsh to his prisoners of war, but a devoted family man, and very much loved his wife Livia. Antony had pulled his army into position, and it was only natural for him to avenge the assassination of his good friend Caesar. Brutus had a hard face and a stiff, ungracious character, as he showed in his treatment of the Asian cities. Cassius was the first to commit suicide in the Battle of Philippi, and Brutus did the same soon after. But many legionaries fell in battle on both sides. At the very edge of the battleground, the river Ganges ran red with the blood of the legionaries. On the Sabbath, we went outside the city gate to the river, where we expected to find a place of prayer. We sat down and began to speak to the women who had gathered there. One of those listening was a woman named Lydia, a dealer in purple cloth from the city of Thyatira. The Lord opened her heart to respond to Paul's message. Lydia was the first person in Greece to be baptized by Paul. This ancient road was used to bring the marble from the quarries to be turned into statues. Marble chips can be found easily, and this highway is called the Via Egnatia, named after the Roman engineer who built it, Ignatius. The chariot ruts are carved deep into the paving stones, telling us that they were putting on the brakes at this point to turn into the Forum. Romans built highways much like we do. First, level the surface, create a concave underbed, then fill with sand, rock, and gravel, with the paving stones on top, forming a convex topping to drain off the rainwater. These paving stones are 6 inches thick. That is why the highway used by Paul to walk across Greece is still there. It was here in Philippi that Paul cured a young girl from her talent at seeing the future. Her masters realized that they could no longer earn money from her talent at fortune-telling, so they had Paul and Silas flogged and thrown into prison. When they found he was a Roman citizen, they hurried to set him free and rush him out of the city. That prison is still there in Philippi. And when we read the story in Acts, we see how Paul was freed and even converted and baptized his own jailer. In many of these Roman houses, we find the impluvium, sort of a decorative pool in the atrium. And all the ancient Roman cities had very sophisticated public latrines for travelers. An inscription of the man who built this city, King Philip II of Macedon, who was the father of Alexander the Great. And Plato is mentioned here, and Vespasian, the Roman emperor that built the Colosseum of Rome. They have found at least 2 large Christian churches here in ancient Philippi. Many soldiers were pardoned by Caesar Augustus, the young Octavian, and they colonized Philippi and settled down here with their land grants. It was their grandchildren that were listening to Paul's lectures by the river. Paul and Silas now moved toward Thessalonica, the land of the Thessalonians, passing through Amphipolis and Apollonia. The ancient cities all seem to be placed within an easy 1 day's walk from each other. No, you are not in Tibet, and this is not Shangri-La. It is the monasteries of Mount Athos. A couple of brothers going fishing this morning. It is likely that fugitives from religious persecution first settled here in the 8th century, if not earlier. This peninsula runs right underneath the route of Paul and extends out into the Aegean Sea for about 31 miles. It has its own administration and is not governed by Athens. In 1312, authority was relinquished from the Byzantine emperor to the patriarch, and to this day they still use the Julian calendar, 13 days behind the rest of Europe. Many orders and many nationalities make up this monastic refuge. There are Russian, Greek, Bulgarian, and Serbian monasteries. No women are allowed on the peninsula, not even as visitors. Even female animals are banned, as are males under 21 years of age. Thessalonica, in northern Greece. This historic city has broad sidewalks and shade trees on every street. It is the second largest city in Greece, next to Athens. The promenade along the seafront goes for several miles and offers a perfect place for the family evening promenade. This is tradition in Greece that can be seen in every city and town, the evening promenade. Paul walks into the city on the Via Egnatia and under the Arch of Galerius, and immediately begins speaking in the synagogue. Well, who are these Romans we have been talking about? They were a small Latin tribe that learned how to conquer. They learned their fighting skills in the circuses, the amazing chariot races. They fought lions so they could learn to fight whole civilizations. They learned how to administer to an empire and tax their subjects, and as long as they could conquer, they would flourish. Even though most of the emperors were cruel and incompetent, they would survive for 1,000 years as a major power. They copied the Roman Forum from the Greek Agora and copied the best from all civilizations that they conquered, learning something from everybody. The Zealots went to the house of Jason to arrest Paul. But this man Jason outsmarted them and put Paul and Silas on the highway in the middle of the night and sent them toward Berea, about 40 miles distant. Berea is now called Veria, and it is in the foothills of Mount Olympus. Here is a beautiful mosaic of Paul on the ancient rostrum where great philosophers made their speeches to the Bereans. The Greeks use the Hebrew word. They call it the vima. In Latin, we know it as rostrum. Now the Bereans were of more noble character than the Thessalonians, for they received the message with great eagerness and examined the scriptures every day to see if what Paul said was true. Many of the Jews believed, as did also a number of prominent Greek women and many Greek men. When the Zealots of Thessalonica learned that Paul was preaching the word of God at Berea, they went there too, agitating the crowds and stirring them up. The brothers immediately sent Paul to the coast. He would go aboard a ship and sail to Athens. Paul passed just underneath Mount Olympus, where the pagan gods were born. The 12 Olympian gods lived up here on mountain peaks. Zeus, king of the gods. On this mountain peak was his brother Poseidon, god of the sea. Paul is on his way to Athens to challenge these false gods. He passed by the battleground of Thermopylae, where one lone Spartan still fights on against the Persians. Paul would eventually arrive in Athens, the city of Athena. Athena stood in here, so tall her helmet scratched the ceiling. Her robes were solid gold. Her robes were the treasury of Athens. She was the great goddess of wisdom, the mother goddess of all Athenians. The gods of the Greeks so prominently displayed on the beautiful temples. They were taken away by Lord Elgin. They're now in the British National Museum in London. After Paul was here, the Christians built their church, and they built their church inside the Parthenon. Below the Acropolis is the theater of Herodes Atticus, the wealthiest man in all of Greece at that time. And his best friend was the Roman Emperor Hadrian, who built this temple to the Olympian Zeus. The Romans called him Jupiter. The Olympic Stadium and the Olympic athletes. The first Olympiad was held in the city of Olympia in the year 776 BC. This becomes the year 1 to the ancient Greeks. Athens, the intellectual and cultural center of the universe. The great marketplace, the Agora, where Paul would engage people in conversation, using the same techniques as Socrates had 400 years before. Here is the great Stoa, the Stoa of Attalus, reproduced for us by the American Institute of Classical Studies. A great shopping mall, with 21 shops upstairs and 21 shops downstairs. It is also where the great philosophers would teach their students in the cool of the marble. Socrates teaching Plato, Plato teaching Aristotle, who would go to Pella and teach Alexander the Great. Paul teaching anyone who would listen. Listen now from the scripture and try to imagine Paul in this great agora. So he reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews and the God-fearing Greeks. A group of Epicurean and Stoic philosophers began to dispute with him. Some of them asked, "What is this babbler trying to say? He seems to be advocating foreign gods." Then they took him and brought him to a meeting of the Areopagus, where they said to him, "May we know what this new teaching is that you are presenting?" These Stoic philosophers were very interested in any new ideas. Paul then stood up in the meeting of the Areopagus and said, "Men of Athens, I see that in every way you are very religious. For as I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, 'To an unknown God.' Now what you worship as something unknown, I am going to proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth and does not live in temples built by hands. He is not served by human hands as if he needed anything, because he himself gives all men life and breath and everything else. From one man he made every nation of men, that they should inhabit the whole earth, and he determined the times set for them and the exact places where they should live. God did this so that men would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he is not far from each one of us, for in him we live and move and have our being." When they heard about the resurrection of the dead, some of them sneered, but others said, "We want to hear you again on this subject." At that, Paul left the council. A few became followers of Paul and believed, Among them was Dionysus, a member of the Areopagos, also a woman named Damaris, and a number of others. After this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. There he met a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla. The Roman Emperor Claudius had ordered all the Jews to leave Rome. Well, Paul went to see them, and because he was a tent maker as they were, he stayed and worked with them. The eastern harbor of Corinth is called Cenchrea. From the ancient lighthouse, we can look down into the crystal clear harbor and see the foundations of the ancient warehouse buildings. Paul's ship drops anchor and he steps ashore. The Christians of Corinth would build a basilica here on the harbor, and for some strange reason this entire coastline sank. But we can look down and see the original steps. From here, the Greeks would drag their ships across the Isthmus of Corinth. We can still see the dragging place, the doikos. They probably used wooden rollers. Julius Caesar wanted to dig a canal, and so did the Emperor Nero, but it wasn't finished until the 19th century. The Corinth Canal saves 200 miles for modern-day shipping. Acro-Corinth rises above the city where the temple of Aphrodite once stood. The city itself is on the plain, where the temple of Apollo still stands after 2,600 years. Aphrodite, the goddess of love, with her Eros and a satyr, she ruled this city with 1,000 prostitutes. Corinth, a city of unbelievable vice. Sailors and ship captains from every dominion of the ancient world, coming from as far away as China. Well, the Romans had their baths, but the Greeks had their fountain houses. People would gather here to find out what was going on in the world. In a way, it served as a newspaper, a social gathering place, for not only a source of sweet spring water, but as a place of conversation. And what a perfect place for the apostle to tell his good news. This young couple came all the way from Marseille in southern France. They came to study Paul. And this German couple point to the Vima, the rostrum, where the great orators gave their speeches. We know that Paul was here for 16 months, working as a tent maker with Aquila and Priscilla. It is to these Corinthians that he gives his most wonderful message. If I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I am only a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have the gift of prophecy and can fathom all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have a faith that can move mountains, but have not love, I am nothing. If I give all I possess to the poor and surrender my body to the flames, but have not love, I gain nothing. Love is patient. Love is kind. It does not envy. It does not boast. It is not proud. It is not rude. It is not self-seeking. It is not easily angered. It keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always preserves. Love never fails, but where there are prophecies, they will cease. Where there are tongues, they will be stilled. Where there is knowledge, it will pass away. For we know in part, and we prophesy in part. But when perfection comes, the imperfect disappears. When I was a child, I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I put childish ways behind me. Now we see but a poor reflection, as in a mirror. Then we shall see face to face. Now I know in part. Then I shall know fully, even as I am fully known. And now these three remain: faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is love, because God is love. Antioch. The city becomes a new home for Christians who were dispersed from Jerusalem. This church above the city is actually a huge cave where the early Christians met in secret. Above the earliest of Christian churches, a mysterious relief carved onto the rocky cliff. It appears to be a large bust of a woman with a veil. We are to learn that it was carved around 175 BC, and it is Sharon, the legendary boatman who ferried souls across the river Styx into the underworld. After spending some time in Antioch, Paul set out from there and traveled from place to place throughout the region of Galatia and Phrygia, strengthening all the disciples. He would pass through his hometown of Tarsus. He was obviously very proud to be a Tarsian. When talking with the Roman military commander in Jerusalem, "I am a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of no mean city." In this he was certainly correct, Tarsus being a very great center of learning and commerce. This young Turkish boy almost completely simulates the uphill struggle Paul experienced as an apostle, carrying the word of Jesus to the cities of Asia. Once again, Paul would leave his home and walk the highway into the Taurus Mountains to begin his third missionary journey. Well, what does he look like? We have a description in the apocryphal Acts of Paul and Thecla. It says, "He was a man, small in size, bald-headed, bandy-legged, well-built, with eyebrows meeting, a rather long nose, and full of grace. For sometimes he seemed like a man, and sometimes he has the countenance of an angel." He was a man of the city, a pure urban type person, but he walked through the mountains as if he was a man of the countryside. If he walked through Phrygia on the third journey, he would have passed close by the region of Cappadocia. He could not know it, but 200 years after his death, The Christian brethren would use this moonscape for a refuge from Arab raiders and Mongols. They carved homes for themselves out of volcanic tufa and created whole cities. They were known as troglodytes in the Greek language. Little has changed among the people of Cappadocia since Bible times. From the 3rd century onwards, these rock dwellings would serve as a haven for Christians. These homes carved from rocky tufa have stairways leading to bedrooms, kitchens with ovens, and storage rooms for grains and citrus. Many are still occupied. People still live here. The Turks call this place the land of the fairy chimneys. A few miles from the large farming town of Nevşehir lies the Gureme Valley, where we find the most famous of the rock churches. Students of early Christian art have a field day here, as the paintings in the Cappadocian churches provide a complete span of medieval Christian art. Narrative cycles of the life of Christ from the apocryphal Gospels. We do not know how the Christians found the underground cities. They must have noticed the wind shafts that were interspersed throughout the villages and hidden between walls and under buildings. This city has over 40 miles of passageway. They have found 30 of these underground cities, and they will find more before they're finished. This city is called Derinkuyu, which means deep well in the Turkish language. 300 feet underground on the 9th story, the well is to be observed. This chamber is connected with another underground city 9 kilometers away by a long tunnel. The two cities shared the water from this well. Whenever they were approached by an enemy, they disappeared into the underground passages and pulled the mill wheels in to block the entrance. Who created these underground cities? Well, this is one of the great mysteries of the world. But this incredible refuge has been used right up to 1839, when the local population went underground to escape the invading Egyptian army of Ibrahim Pasha. It is thought that Paul must have traveled to Hierapolis and Laodicea, but for some reason did not stop at Colossae. The city gate of the Greco-Roman city of Hierapolis in the Lycus Valley. It was customary for all the ancient cities to have a necropolis outside the city gates, a city of the dead. The tholos, or circular tomb, is that of the Lydians. We know this same style in the ancient Etruscan city of Caere outside Rome. It could be the proof we need to know the origins of the sophisticated Etruscans. Ionian tombs and Lycian tombs and Roman house tombs are all here. When we see Greek inscriptions on Roman tombs, we must remember that the Romans that lived here in Asia Minor spoke and wrote in Greek. In fact, all educated Romans could speak the Greek language. Jews were here in heavy numbers, and Paul tells in his letter to the Colossians that Epaphras is working hard for them in Laodicea and Hierapolis. They have identified a Christian church between the two city gates. It was not very large, but it was all they needed. On the sidewalk in front of the church, we can just barely make out a Christian symbol, the circle of life. In Hierapolis, a mineral spring gives forth hot mineral water at 85 degrees Fahrenheit, winter and summer. It was used by the Romans for their caldaria, or hot water bath. Romans seemed to love their baths. All the cities had them, and in the age of the emperors, the imperial baths became enormous. 2 football fields could fit inside them. They had dressing rooms, libraries, gymnasiums, and hot, cold, and tepid baths that they took in succession. They had hot air baths and hot water baths, heated by furnaces under the floors and moved from room to room by ingenious piping. They seemed to know much when it came to the curative properties of hot mineral water. This Roman bath at Hierapolis is the only Roman bath still in business. The Turks call this place Cotton Castle. In their language, it's Pamukkale. From Laodicea, we can look across the Lycus Valley and see the white cliffs of Hierapolis. From the scripture, we hear Jesus warning, "I know your deeds, that you are neither cold nor hot. I wish you were either one or the other. So, because you are lukewarm, neither hot nor cold, I am about to spit you out of my mouth." Paul wrote to only 3 individuals in his life. 1 to Timothy, 1 to Titus, and 1 letter was to Philemon of Colossae to save the life of this slave Onesimus, who ran away from his master and followed Paul all the way to Rome. Paul now walks down the Lycus Valley to Ephesus. The city of Aphrodisias is a little less than halfway. This was the favorite city of Octavian, Caesar Augustus. Here was the temple of Aphrodite. The most wealthy Roman houses had an atrium with an impluvium, a pool in the center of the room that caught the rainwater from the compluvium in the ceiling. Hadrian's baths and a fabulous stadium are striking features of Aphrodisias. Spectators watching naked athletes in all the events of a typical track meet. Stadiums were usually a uniform length of 600 Greek feet or 625 Roman feet. This became a standard unit for measuring distances. I live 5 stadia from the city center, for an example. The theater, with its beautifully preserved stage building, has a deep orchestra, which tells us that this theater was used for gladiatorial combat. Ancient bridges still stand in remote regions of the countryside, surviving countless earthquakes over the centuries. The Romans were unsurpassed in their building of paved highways and bridges and aqueducts. Paul could easily look down into this valley and see an aqueduct emerging from a tunnel. The Roman engineers would find freshwater springs in the mountains that could not be tainted at the source. And after they ran their tests of the water by checking the eyes and bones of people living nearby, they gave the order for the aqueducts to be built. This aqueduct emerges from a tunnel to feed the fountains of the main street of Ephesus. Ephesus, the capital city of the Roman Empire in Asia, the end of the Silk Route. Tyche is the Greek goddess of fortune. She's in charge of the city's destiny. The Romans called her Fortuna. The true elite of the city were Roman citizens who lived in terrace houses. The floors were usually completely covered with black and white mosaics in geometric designs. In winter, clay pipes carried hot air to various rooms of the house. Hot and cold water were piped into the dining room, kitchen, and bathrooms. Meals were prepared in kitchens and served to the family as they lounged on couches. They decorated their houses with frescoes from birds and fish to mythological scenes. The upper floors were the bedrooms, and wooden stairways would allow access as high as 3 stories. It was a mile from the city that her temple stood. She was Artemis, the mother goddess of fertility. The Romans called her Diana. Paul preached that gods made with hands are not gods. This was the beginning of the danger for Paul. Eventually, she would be replaced by a gentle little woman named Mary. Jesus spoke from the cross. "Dear woman, here is your son." And to his favorite disciple he said, "Here is your mother." And from that moment on, this disciple took her into his home. It was too dangerous to stay in Jerusalem after the crucifixion. Mother Mary traveled to Ephesus with John, since that was the city of his missionary activities. It is said that this was her house. Paul is now walking on the harbor street toward the theater. You can see the game boards and Christian symbols on the pavement. Omens of danger are everywhere for Paul. The silversmiths are meeting in their guild hall. Demetrius is stirring them up, suggesting that Paul will take away their livelihood. People will no longer buy their silver shrines of the mother goddess. They will be ruined. Paul's friends are trying to stop him from entering the theater. They can feel the danger. Paul had been doing his job only too well. People were turning away from Artemis. They believed in the resurrection. Paul had been in Ephesus now for almost 3 years, and the people were turning toward Jesus. "24,000 people are in the theater. Paul enters the orchestra. Waiting for him was the great merchant class of Ephesus, the people who knew the pagan gods were doing nothing for them. Paul and his message had arrived just in time. The whole city was open to his new faith. And suddenly, Demetrius shouted, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians!"
Great is Artemis of the Ephesians.
The people were enraged. "No! Oh no! They're dragging Gaius and Aristarchus into the theater! They will kill them! Paul, you must leave the city now! Take him to the harbor! They're tearing to pieces! To the harbor! Paul, you must come! Come now, Paul! Run!" Paul now disappears from history. We lose track of him for 2 years. The Bible says that Paul set out for Macedonia. This means he sailed north. He could have stepped ashore in Smyrna and walked the 60 miles to Sardis, which had one of the 7 churches. This was the original home of the Lydians, but during the Roman period, the Jewish community from which the Christians had sprung enjoyed more privileges in Sardis than all the other cities in Asia. The synagogue serves as the civic center of the Jewish community. They become even schools for teaching the young. Jesus taught in the synagogue. Paul was to begin his entire career as an apostle in the synagogues of Asia. From Sardis, it is but a beautiful walk through the hills and valleys to Pergamum. The city of Pergamum was laid out in terraces on a high acropolis, and the theater is the steepest in the ancient world. Students of the Bible will know how the altar of Zeus, which was standing here until taken away to Berlin, is referred to in Revelations as the throne of Satan. Nike was the symbol of the city, goddess of victory. Pergamum is the site of one of the 7 churches of Asia. And the Christians used this building for their church, just as they used the Parthenon for their church in Athens. It was built by the Romans for the Egyptian merchant colony. It was a sanctuary of the Egyptian gods. This enormous building must have been spectacular, with marble facing over brick. It was 3 stories high, with a great hall, colonnaded courtyards over 200 yards long, and a large forecourt for ceremonial processions. There were underground passages for the god Osiris to communicate with the underworld, and bathing pools in the courtyard, which was part of the cult, and also to symbolize the sacred river Nile. Below the Acropolis, at the end of this colonnaded street, is the sanctuary of Asclepius, the god of medicine. It was mostly a public religious sanctuary, open to all who would come. The sacred well was said to cure people of eye trouble, asthma, and respiratory problems. The tunnel is said to have been where the doctors made suggestions to the mental patients to cure them of mental problems. But it was more likely just a tunnel leading from the sacred well to the patient's dormitory. This is one of the great medical sanctuaries of the ancient world, the others being at Epidavros and the island of Kos, where the father of medicine lived, the great Hippocrates. We follow Paul as far as the ancient city of Troy, near the Hellespont. This young man is Mustafa Askin, and he was born in the village of Hisarlik, where Heinrich Schliemann lived when he was digging here in the early 1870s. Mustafa knows the story well. Helen was stolen away from her husband Menelaus, king of the Spartans, by Paris, the son of the Trojan king Priam. The Greek chieftains, including Agamemnon, came with their armies to fight the Trojans. They were here for 10 long years when Ulysses advised using a trick. They built a huge wooden horse, and the best Greek warriors hid inside. The rest of the Greeks sailed their ships around the other side of the island of Tenedos, while others hid behind the cliffs along the edge of the plains. After several more tricks were played on the Trojans, they finally were convinced the Greeks had sailed away for good. They celebrated, and as they slept, the Greek champions came out of the horse, and the sack of Troy began. Paul and 8 of his friends, including Luke, emerged at Alexandria Troas, which is just 1 full day's walk from ancient Troy. We went on to the ship and sailed for Assos, where we were going to take Paul aboard. He had made this arrangement because he was going there on foot. Well, we ask ourselves, why does Paul want to walk to Assos? Perhaps he knows that it's the last time he will walk on the highways of Asia. And as it turned out, it was the last time that he walked these highways. The city of Assos is sitting on a volcanic cone about 300 feet above the sea. The archaeologists are just now bringing the city out of the ground. Here is the highway arriving at the city gates. Aristotle established a school of philosophy here, and the city was famous for animal breeding and a source of white limestone used for making sarcophagi. Luke and the others were patiently waiting for Paul down in the harbor. Unless the winds were against them, they would have arrived before Paul. The harbor is unspoiled and maintains its same size and shape as it was in the time of Paul. Luke goes on to tell us, when he met us at Assos, we took him aboard and went on to Mytilene. Well, Mytilene is the city on the island of Lesbos, where Sappho wrote her lyric poetry 600 years before Paul. The island is just 12 miles from Assos. The next day we set sail from there and arrived off Chios. The day after, we crossed to Samos, and on the following day arrived at Miletus. Paul had decided to sail past Ephesus to avoid spending time in the province of Asia. for he was in a hurry to reach Jerusalem, if possible, by the day of Pentecost. It was also too dangerous for Paul to go back to Ephesus. Miletus. The lions flanked the entrance to the harbor. From Miletus, Paul sent to Ephesus for the elders of the church. And when they arrived, he said to them, "And now, compelled by the Spirit, I am going to Jerusalem, not knowing what will happen to me there. I only know that in every city the Holy Spirit warns me that prison and hardships are facing me. However, I consider my life worth nothing to me, if only I may finish the race and complete the task the Lord Jesus has given me, the task of testifying to the gospel of God's grace. None of you will see me again." They all wept as they embraced him and kissed him. What grieved them most was his statement that they would never see his face again. The people of Miletus would pray to the god Apollo here. This temple was considered by Strabo, the Greek geographer, to be the greatest of all Greek temples, more spectacular even than the temple of Artemis at Ephesus. The oracle of Apollo at Didyma was the most important in all Anatolia and second only to Delphi in the entire ancient world. It is located on a point of land a few miles south of the city. This architectural decoration that we see in all Greek temples was inspired by a river in Asia Minor called the Meander. The traditional landing place for Paul on the island of Rhodes is this natural bay, now called St. Paul's Bay. There are many natural wonders in the Aegean Sea, and this is one of them, a narrow opening in the rocks where ships can enter and be completely protected from storms. Paul returned to Palestine, his third missionary journey drawing to a close. They arrived in the city of Patara and changed ships. They found one bound for Phoenicia. Patara today is imprisoned by sand dunes. The dunes run up the coast for miles in every direction. A triumphal arch has the inscription, "Patara, the capital of the Lycian nation." We can clearly see the ancient harbor here in Patara, the harbor where Paul would leave one ship and go aboard another, bound for Caesarea in Palestine. Paul is almost murdered in Jerusalem. The zealots want him put on trial, but the Roman military commander rescued him and took him to Caesarea with an escort of 200 Roman soldiers. "I want to go before Caesar for my trial," he says. This amazed the Roman governor Festus because Paul had committed no crime. "To Caesar you shall go," he said. The prisoners were under the command of a centurion named Julius. Their first port of call was Myra. In the 4th century, this man Nicholas was the local bishop. He was so kind to children, especially the poor. He became a saint, and the legend of Santa Claus originates here in Myra with Saint Nicholas. We know that they were sailing along this coast of Lycia where there are so many caves. The Cilician pirates would hide whole ships in these grottos, hiding from the Roman ships that were looking for them with a vengeance. Underwater, you can see their wine and water jars that they threw overboard whenever they became broken. Paul knew this coast very well. You can look down and see the ancient harbors. You can look up and see the steps coming out of the sea. Many ancient cities have sunk beneath the sea since the time of Paul. Paul's ship is now fighting a terrible storm as it approaches Cnidus. They never did get past this point. They had to fall away and look for a safe anchorage. But we continued. On the hill above the ancient city stood the most beautiful statue of Aphrodite. It was done by the great sculptor Praxiteles. Pliny tells us that the famous statue of Aphrodite stood in a shrine which allowed the image of the goddess to be viewed from every side. The Tholos temple is accepted as the site of the Aphrodite, but is not thoroughly proven as yet. Cnidus belonged to the Dorian Hexapolis, a league of cities consisting of Cnidus, Halicarnassos, the island of Kos, and the cities on roads called Lindos, Camiros, and Iliassos. City-states in Greece usually banded together for mutual protection. These cities of the Dorian Hexapolis are all less than 1 day's sail from each other. The military harbor faces the north, and Strabo tells us that 20 fighting triremes could berth in here. Triremes had 3 banks of oars and were the fastest ships of the ancient world, usually used by pirates. Luke goes on to tell us, when the wind did not allow us to hold our course, we sailed to the lee of Crete. We moved along the coast with difficulty and came to a place called Fair Havens near the town of Lazea. Well, Fair Havens is Kalalimenes in the Greek language, and it has protection from the winds from at least 2 directions. They must have been able to tie the ship to trees on the shore to secure it from being battered on the rocks. Julius, the centurion, allowed the prisoners to sleep in this cave. They were here for 2 weeks. Paul had already been shipwrecked 3 times in his life. He knew about the winds of winter. He tried to warn them. Men, I can see that our voyage is going to be disastrous and bring great loss to the ship and cargo, and to our lives also. The centurion, instead of listening to what Paul said, followed the advice of the pilot and the owner of the ship. Luke now tells us, since the harbor was unsuitable to winter in, the majority decided that we should sail on, hoping to reach Phoenix and winter there. Well, Phoenix is a harbor on Crete a little farther toward the west. They weighed anchor and sailed along the shore of Crete. Before long, a wind of hurricane force swept down from the mountains. There were 276 people on board that ship, and for 2 weeks were driven by the storm across to the islands called Melita, now called Malta. After 3 months, they set out in another Alexandrian grain ship named Castor and Pollux. They sailed to Syracuse on Sicily, and then to Rhegium, and with a south wind sailed smoothly through the Straits of Messina to Puteoli. We find them now in the Straits of Messina, Sicily on one side and the peninsula of Italy on the other. Paul steps ashore in Italy, in this harbor of Puteoli. Just behind the harbor is a market hall where Julius the centurion allows the prisoners to rest for 1 week. Then they all walk the 140 miles to Rome on the Via Appia. What a feeling it must have been for Paul to see the first milepost. He is now just 1 mile from the center of Rome, the Roman Forum. And isn't it ironic to have the Via Cilicia right next to the Via Appia? Paul would not have seen this great wall of Aurelian. This was built about 200 years after his death. The wall that Paul would have seen is called the Servian Wall. It was built by the Etruscan king, Servius Tullius, in the 4th century BC. The mother city of the Roman Empire. No city on earth was so magnificent as Rome when Paul arrived. Paul had lived through Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and now he would arrive in Rome at the worst possible time, during the reign of the egomaniacal emperor Nero. Paul lived in a private apartment in Rome, and it is said that Seneca, the great Stoic philosopher and tutor to Nero, paid a visit to him and was curious about his new faith in the resurrection. It is even told that Paul met Nero in the dark streets of Rome when Nero was in one of his charades, dressing in disguise and mixing with the Romans in the streets. He often did that. The Temple of Vesta is still visible in the Roman Forum. The Vestal Virgins watching over the sacred fire of Rome. The Senate and the people of Rome, they always voted together. The Curia, the old Senate building. Rome must have been so beautiful. The triumphal arches were not yet seen in Rome. They would come later, after Paul, with the emperors Titus and Septimius Severus, and with the first Christian emperor, Constantine. There is a legend that tells us Paul and Peter were in this prison for a short time. It is under the Capitoline Hill where now we find Castor, one of the twins that helped save Rome, and his twin brother Pollux, the gods of seafarers and travelers. Isn't it odd that the ship that brought Paul on the final leg of his journey to Italy was named Castor and Pollux? Paul is finally taken to the Pauline Basilica for his trial. The Roman prosecutor is very effective. This man Paul is a threat to the state of Rome and the power of Caesar. Nero is so paranoid by then, he's condemned his own mother to death as well as his tutor Seneca. He condemns Paul to immediate execution. The Christians in Rome are weeping. They know they can do nothing to save him. They're not strong enough. Yet. Paul is taken with the other prisoners past this pyramid tomb of Gaius Cestius, who was a governor of Egypt at one time. He's led out onto the highway leading to the port of Ostia, the Via Ostiensis. The executioner will use the 3-mile post to behead his prisoners. Paul tells us in his letter to Timothy, "The time has come for my departure. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. Now there is in store for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day, and not only to me, but also to all who have longed for his appearing." Paul was lifted up by a woman and carried to her personal burial crypt. Her name was Lucina, and his tomb was found with his name on it under the reign of Constantine. And from it sprang St. Paul's outside the walls. Paul knew that if he would arrive in Rome, his message would go out in every direction, just like the Roman highways. And it did.